Do you believe in blood over everything, or not anymore?
When I stepped onto that stage, under the sterile brilliance of hotel ballroom lighting and a blizzard of camera flashes, I scanned the front row like someone still dumb enough to believe in miracles. Like a grown woman still searching for the people who told her to stop embarrassing herself with big dreams, still hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone had made the trip, someone had changed their mind, someone cared enough to sit in a seat with my name on it. But there was no one. No mom in her stiff blazer pretending to be proud. No Kelly balancing her perfect little purse on her lap, whispering criticism through a smile. Not even Jason, who usually only showed up for food and free booze. Every seat reserved for Rachel Moore's family sat empty, and I stood there on the edge of that stage trying not to let that fact ruin what should have been the moment of my life. The host handed me the mic. I took it, nodded politely, and told myself to breathe, to focus, to not let 17 years of emotional dust come pouring out of my mouth just because my family once again decided I wasn't worth showing up for. I had rehearsed a neat, polished speech. One with buzzwords and phrases like community impact and transformational innovation in education. But as I stared at that first row of abandonment wrapped in white seat covers, something inside me uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, like a ribbon snapping free from years of tight knots. So I smiled. I smiled wide enough that it hurt my cheeks and said, "This one's for everyone who said I'd never make it." And I let that sentence hang in the air like smoke in a sealed room. The applause came anyway. They clapped, maybe even louder than they would have if I'd stayed professional and safe. The cameras flashed harder. I could feel the eyes of strangers watching me like I was doing something brave, but it didn't feel brave. It felt necessary. Like survival. Backstage, someone from the board shook my hand and said, "That line, wow. Powerful." Was it planned? I didn't answer. I just nodded and smiled the same way I used to when Mom would ask if I liked the gift she forgot to wrap. In the elevator, I checked my phone. 17 unread messages from my mother. 17. One after another. Starting from the second my speech ended, all the way through the media frenzy that followed. I didn't open a single one. Instead, I scrolled back to an old message I'd saved from years ago. One from Mr. Wyatt, my high school computer science teacher, the one who stayed after class to teach me code, who told me I was brilliant before anyone else even knew I existed. He'd written, "One day, they'll regret not standing beside you when the world finally sees you." I had kept it, because back then, it was the only proof I had that someone saw me for more than just the quiet one, the difficult one, the girl who wasn't quite enough to matter. That night, while the world kept sharing my speech and the board asked for a copy to archive, I sat alone on the bed of a hotel suite big enough to make me feel small, staring at those 17 unread messages from the woman who once told me, "Maybe if you smiled more, people would like you." I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't even feel triumphant. I felt clean. Like something had finally burned itself out. I thought back to the time I won the regional science fair in 8th grade and Mom didn't show up because Kelly had a piano recital. Or when I got into Columbia and Jason crashed his car the same week, and the conversation turned to how hard it is for boys to focus these days. Every time I accomplished something, it was met with some form of accidental sabotage. A birthday overshadowed. A job offer ignored. A graduation they showed up late to and left early from. This wasn't new. What was new was the fact that I finally said something. Publicly. In front of 300 people and however many watched the live stream. I powered off my phone. I turned off the lights. And I lay there in the dark, not angry, not proud, but alert, like something inside me had finally woken up after spending decades in a coma. The next morning, I got a call from the education board. They wanted me to do an interview with CNN. I said yes, but only if they included a segment about underfunded schools, not just my personal journey. I knew what I was doing. I was making it impossible for my family to pretend they didn't notice. When the article went live, it was titled, "She Made It Alone, Rachel Moore and the Speech That Shook the Room." There was a photo of me at the podium, mid-sentence, mid-spark, looking like a woman who had nothing left to prove. That same day, my sister Kelly texted, Mom says you exaggerated. You know she would have come if Jason wasn't in town. I didn't reply. Instead, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. A name I hadn't dared whisper in a decade. The man who left when I was 10. The one person whose silence had always felt more honest than the noise my mother made. Dad, I said, I think it's time we talked. But what I didn't tell him, what I didn't tell anyone, was that this wasn't about getting answers anymore. This was about making sure they all finally asked the right questions. And I wasn't done. Not even close. The morning after the ceremony, the world was already in motion, spinning a little faster than usual, as if some invisible will had been nudged just hard enough to change direction. And while my inbox filled with congratulations from colleagues, distant acquaintances, former classmates I hadn't thought about in years, the 17 unread messages from my mother remained untouched, each one sitting like a landmine, neatly lined up in a row, daring me to step forward and detonate. I didn't. Instead, I scrolled through the public reactions, hundreds of comments, reposts, emails, direct messages, and as grateful as I was for the outpouring of support from people I'd never met, there was a dull, familiar ache beneath it all. A hollow in my chest that whispered, they don't know you the way family is supposed to. But that was just it. My family had never really known me, not truly, not deeply, not enough to recognize the moment they were supposed to show up, not enough to understand what it meant to leave a chair empty when the world had finally decided to clap. I made coffee, let it go cold, and then made another cup, this one only slightly warmer, as I opened the family group chat that I'd muted 3 years ago but never left, mostly out of morbid curiosity and some deeply ingrained guilt I still hadn't managed to shed. It was full of what it always was, memes Jason thought were hilarious, but were mostly just lazy. Updates about Kelly's kids, including a blurry video of her youngest saying spaghetti like paschetti, and one photo of my mother's living room. Decorated early for fall, captioned, ready for Thanksgiving. There was no mention of the award. No photo of me at the podium. No shared link to the live stream that had been viewed over 400,000 times overnight. And yet, I had been taught to believe this silence wasn't cruel. It was modest, polite, normal. I understood now that it was neither accidental nor unconscious. It was a pattern, and it was deliberate. In the middle of this digital vacuum, I sent one message, not to my mother, not to Kelly or Jason, but to the one person who had ever offered me warmth without strings. I wrote to Mr. Wyatt. The message was short, but it carried the weight of 100 moments I had once wished my family had noticed. You were the reason I believed in myself enough to speak last night. Thank you for staying when no one else did. Within minutes, he replied. I saw the speech. Still proud. Still here. I sat with that for a long time, reading it again and again, as if the words themselves were stitched with something heavier than letters, something like grace. I hadn't heard from him in years. He'd retired quietly, moved to a cabin up north, and sent me a card every Christmas without fail, always signed with a short message and his crooked handwriting. When I received the card last year, Kelly had laughed and said, "Is that guy still alive?" I hadn't responded then, just smiled tightly and folded the card like a secret. Later that afternoon, after I dodged 2 calls from my mother and one from a number I didn't recognize but had a hometown area code, I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I printed something out. I printed the speech. Not because I wanted to frame it, but because I needed to hold it in my hands and feel the weight of those words, stripped of applause, devoid of lighting, standing on their own without the backdrop of an audience. I took a pen and underlined the sentence that had unraveled everything. This one's for everyone who said I'd never make it. I added a period at the end in heavier ink. Just one dot, but it felt like a nail sealing a door shut. In the evening, my neighbor from 2 floors down knocked and awkwardly handed me a bottle of wine, saying she'd seen the clip online and wanted to congratulate me. I thanked her, offered to pour a glass, and for the first time in years, let someone into my apartment who didn't carry the weight of my past in their eyes. We sat in silence, sipping slowly, and when she asked if my family had been proud, I just smiled and said, they didn't make it. She didn't ask why. She didn't pretend to understand. She just nodded like that made all the sense in the world. But as the night crept in and the wine settled in my chest, warm and quiet, I couldn't help but replay each unread message in my mind, imagining the tone, the guilt, the inevitable pivot into accusation. I knew my mother. Her version of an apology would come dipped in sugar, but it would rot the moment you bit into it. She would say she meant to come. She would say Jason was visiting and needed help. She would say she didn't realize it was that kind of event. And then, like clockwork, she would remind me of how sensitive I've always been, how dramatic, how eager to make everything about me. But not this time. This time, I had said something with a microphone and no one could talk over it. This time, the silence wasn't mine to bear, it was theirs to explain. Just before midnight, I opened my laptop, navigated to the university board's internal portal, and uploaded a proposal I'd been sitting on for months. It was a mentorship program for underserved students, named not after me, not after my family, but after Mr. Wyatt. I'd made sure the launch would go public next month, with media coverage, interviews, ribbon cuttings. And I'd made sure the Moore name appeared nowhere in it. I smiled as I hit submit. Because sometimes revenge doesn't look like fire and fury. Sometimes it looks like erasure. Clean, quiet, permanent. And I wasn't finished. Not yet. It was the kind of sunny, manicured Tuesday afternoon that looked better through glass than it felt in reality. Suburban peace with just enough artifice to make you question whether any of it was ever real to begin with. And as I pulled up to Kelly's house, an oversized beige monolith at the end of a cul-de-sac that smelled like lawn fertilizer and tension, I had the strange sensation of stepping into a performance I hadn't auditioned for, the kind where every line had been rehearsed behind my back and every smile was a weapon dipped in honey. The last time I'd visited her was 2 Christmases ago, when I'd shown up with a gift she never unwrapped and left before dessert because Mom had pulled me aside and whispered, "Maybe don't bring up your work this year, okay? Let Kelly have her moment." As if my existence was some kind of threat to be managed, minimized, made invisible so that her golden child could continue to shine uninterrupted. Kelly answered the door holding a half-eaten granola bar in one hand and her toddler on her hip, hair pulled into a messy bun that looked almost too perfectly unkempt, the kind you see in influencer posts captioned "Real Mom Life," while sponsored products peek out from the background. She offered a tired smile, said something about how chaotic the house has been lately, and motioned for me to come in with the same enthusiasm someone might use to invite a stranger into a dentist's office. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of soy candles and baby wipes, the kind of manufactured domesticity that tried too hard to say, "We're happy here," and not enough to ask whether anyone believed it. Toys scattered the floor like forgotten declarations of joy, and somewhere in the background, a television played a show I didn't recognize, bright colors, high-pitched voices, a level of noise that felt intentional, like camouflage for conversations that had long since lost their meaning. We exchanged small talk, surface-level nonsense about weather, work, and the absurdity of rising grocery prices, until I said something that made her pause mid-sip of her lukewarm coffee. I told her, casually and without emphasis, that I'd been offered a senior advisory position at the university a few miles from here. The pause was microscopic, maybe 2 seconds at most, but in that pause was an entire history of unspoken rivalry, inherited resentment, and the very specific flavor of jealousy that only a sister can serve with a smile. "Oh," she said, too lightly, that's amazing. Wow. You're thinking of moving back." I nodded, watching her carefully, not because I expected her to say something generous, but because I wanted to witness the exact moment she realized that the hierarchy Mom had worked so hard to maintain was shifting beneath her feet. We talked for a while longer, mostly about the kids, her husband's job, the school district rankings, and how tired she'd been lately. I listened. I nodded. I even offered a few sincere compliments about the artwork on her fridge, the decor in her kitchen, the custom-built bookshelf that held mostly parenting manuals and unread self-help books. But beneath all of it, there was an electric current humming under my skin, a restlessness that came from years of being the one who bit her tongue while the others sharpened theirs. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door and gave me a hug that was more performative than affectionate, like she needed to be seen hugging me by someone else in the room, even though no one was watching. As I stepped outside into the blinding sunlight, she called after me, "Hey, by the way, Mom's been wanting to have dinner. All of us. Just family. She says we should clear the air." I turned, adjusting my sunglasses, and replied without hesitation, "Sure. But I'm bringing something." I didn't wait to see her reaction. Back in my apartment later that night, I pulled out the worn leather notebook I'd kept since college, the one filled with notes, letters I never sent, and moments I never spoke aloud. I flipped through the pages, some of which were stained with coffee, others smudged with the weight of years. Inside were exact dates, quotes, and receipts, emotional and literal, of the ways my voice had been silenced, diminished, rewritten. I wasn't planning to weaponize them in some explosive confrontation. That would have been too easy, too expected. No, I was building something quieter, more deliberate, something that didn't rely on their understanding or approval. I was building erasure. But this time, it was mine to wield. That same night, I finalized the documentation for the mentorship program I'd submitted under Mr. Wyatt's name. I'd included a press release draft, one that made no mention of my family or upbringing, no nostalgic nods to humble beginnings or strong maternal figures. It was clean, professional, and pointedly impersonal. When it launched, the headlines would read, "Former Student Honors Unsung Mentor Through Landmark Education Initiative." And when Mom saw it, and she would realize that not only had she been excluded, she had become irrelevant to the story I was finally allowed to tell. As I typed the final sentence, my phone buzzed again. A message from Kelly this time. "Dinner's set for Friday. Mom says to keep it civil." I stared at the screen for a long while before responding. "I'll be there. And don't worry, I'll be very civil." But civility, I had learned, wasn't about silence or submission. It was about precision. And I intended to be exact. Because the truth is, we were never really close. Not as sisters. Not as friends. Not even as enemies. We were assigned roles in a family drama none of us auditioned for, and now, for the first time in my life, I was about to step off the stage and write the script myself. And this time, I wouldn't leave out the parts they wanted me to forget. The sky that evening was one of those slow-burning autumn sunsets, the kind that doesn't so much fade as it peels away layer by layer, as if the sun itself can't quite decide whether to leave or stay a little longer. And as I pulled up to my mother's house, still the same off-white two-story colonial with the chipped shutters and the hydrangeas that somehow never thrived, I felt a calm that was far too quiet to be natural, a stillness that usually only comes just before a storm finally breaks. After days of holding itself back, the house looked almost unchanged from the last time I was here, maybe a few more cracks in the walkway, maybe a little more dust settled on the porch lights, but the atmosphere, the undercurrent of performance and pressure, that was exactly the same. Like walking into a museum of denial curated with forced smiles and the silent weight of decades' worth of unspoken truths. I parked deliberately across the street, not in the driveway, not in the place Mom always insisted was reserved for family, because the symbolism of my decision was too important to waste. I was not arriving as a daughter, not as the scapegoat, not as the one who sits quietly while the others rewrite history in real time. I was arriving as someone who remembered everything, who had documented the omissions and the insults and the suffocating expectations disguised as love, and I had brought with me not just memories, but evidence. Kelly opened the door with a tension in her shoulders so subtle I don't think she knew she was holding it, and Jason, who had somehow arrived early for once, was already seated at the dining room table, nursing a glass of wine and looking every bit like a man who planned to stay silent as long as he wasn't asked to choose sides. My mother stood at the kitchen counter arranging a tray of reheated appetizers with the same exaggerated care she always used when she wanted to distract herself from discomfort, and when she turned to greet me, her eyes lingered a second too long on the envelope I held in my hand. Dinner began like everyone before it had, a collection of polite nothings, shallow pleasantries, and carefully curated comments designed to maintain the illusion that we were a family, that we were a unit, that this table had ever been a place of warmth or safety for me. They asked about the weather, about traffic, about whether I'd found a new apartment yet closer to the university, and I played along just enough to keep the rhythm from unraveling too quickly. But then, just as the conversation turned toward Jason's latest entrepreneurial venture that sounded suspiciously like another half-baked scheme to avoid real work, I set the envelope down in the center of the table with the kind of quiet finality that silences even the most persistent denial. "What's this?" Mom asked, her voice tight and bright. "It's a list," I said, carefully unsealing the envelope and sliding out several neatly typed pages. "Of things you don't remember." "But I do." There was a pause so long I could feel the air leave the room, as if even the walls had braced themselves for what was coming. "These," I continued, tapping the first page, "are every award, every milestone, every published article, promotion, speech, recognition, every single thing I did from high school until now. And beneath each one, I've written down who acknowledged it and who didn't." Jason leaned back slightly, shifting uncomfortably, but said nothing. Kelly looked away, pretending to be fascinated by her wine glass. And Mom, ever the actress, let out a soft laugh, as if this were some elaborate joke she didn't quite understand yet. "This is absurd," she said, reaching for the papers. I pulled them slightly closer before she could touch them. "You once said you just forgot to come to my college graduation because Jason was sick. But he posted photos that day of himself at a concert. You said you missed my book launch because you didn't understand the invite. But Kelly helped design the invitation. You've made a career out of selective memory, and I've spent mine trying not to make you uncomfortable with the truth." There was silence. Deep, electric silence. And then, slowly, I pushed forward the final page, one that wasn't a list, but a letter. Not to them. To myself. "I wrote this 6 years ago," I said. "The night I got tenure and no one called. Not even a text. I wrote it instead of crying. I didn't read it aloud. I didn't need to. The act of placing it on the table, among the chicken parmesan and the uneaten salad, was enough. It existed. That was the point." Then I leaned back and let them sit with it. Let them process the idea that the quiet daughter they'd built their version of events around was no longer willing to be quiet. That the narrative they had controlled for decades had slipped out of their hands, and now sat in ink and paper in front of them, undeniable and unforgiving. Kelly was the first to speak, voice brittle, thin. "Why are you doing this?" "Because the apology I want doesn't exist," I said. "And the recognition I need won't come from people who still think I'm making things up. So I've decided to stop hoping. I've decided to start documenting." Mom looked at me then, not with anger, but with something worse, fear. Fear that the story she'd spent her life constructing was being dismantled in front of her by the very child she'd always underestimated. "You're going to regret this," she said, barely above a whisper. I smiled. Not cruelly. Just honestly. Already did. For 36 years. And then I stood up, took the pages back, slid them into the envelope, and walked out the front door without looking back, not because I wanted to be dramatic, not because I thought it made for a good exit, but because I finally understood that their approval was no longer currency I needed to earn. In the car, I sat for a long time, the envelope on the passenger seat like a passenger itself, like a witness to everything that had just happened. The mentorship program would launch next week. The press coverage was already lined up. Mr. Wyatt's name would be everywhere. Mine would be quietly present, but only if you looked. I wanted it that way. Because sometimes the loudest kind of revenge is not what you say, but what you no longer need to explain. And I had finally, mercifully, run out of explanations. That night, long after I had driven back from the so-called dinner and sat once again alone in the kind of silence that no longer frightened me but had become, in its own way, a sanctuary of truth, I placed the envelope creased, slightly weathered from the pressure of my own hands, on the coffee table, as if it too needed a place to rest after having carried so much weight. The apartment was dim, lit only by the muted glow of a single floor lamp near the window, and outside, the city moved forward as it always did, unaware, unaffected, but oddly comforting in its constancy, as if reminding me that some things continue regardless of whether you're applauded or ignored. I sat on the couch with my knees pulled close, the fabric of my sweater rough beneath my fingers, and for the first time in what felt like years, I allowed myself to simply breathe, without calculating what came next, without bracing for the next omission, the next deflection, the next polished dismissal wrapped in faux concern. My phone, silent now for several hours, sat face down on the armrest beside me, but I could still feel its presence like an itch under my skin, like a ghost trying to remind me that it hadn't disappeared, only waited. And eventually, curiosity, or maybe something more primal, less noble, won. I picked it up, opened it, and stared once more at the 17 unread messages from my mother, each time-stamped within a few short hours after the ceremony, sent in a rapid, nervous burst that read more like a person throwing darts in the dark than someone trying to make meaningful amends. The first message was short, predictable. "Rachel, we need to talk." The next, "You're being really unfair." Then, I didn't know it was that important. As I scrolled further, the tone shifted, as I had expected it would, from confusion to guilt to anger, a rotation I'd grown used to over the years, a cycle as dependable as clockwork and as exhausting as grief. "You embarrassed me. This isn't the way to handle things with family. Your speech made us look bad." Not once, across all 17 attempts, did she say she was sorry in any way that suggested understanding, not even in the disingenuous, hollow manner I would have accepted if only to end the performance. There was no admission, no reckoning, no moment of clarity. Only the familiar: deflect, defend, diminish. I didn't reply. I didn't feel rage. Not even disappointment. What I felt, and what surprised me in its intensity, was a kind of mournful finality, the kind of emotion that comes not from being wounded again, but from realizing that the wound had, in fact, stopped bleeding long ago. And what remained now was scar tissue, tough, immovable, incapable of feeling much of anything. I wasn't seeking closure. I had stopped believing in it years ago. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was to be seen, not as the family's difficult one, not as the overachieving afterthought, not as the cautionary tale they whispered about when I left the room, but as a whole person with needs, with memories, with a story that didn't align neatly with theirs. The world, ironically, had begun to do what they never could. Since the speech, I had been approached by organizations, schools, former students, complete strangers who told me my words had echoed something they had long buried, something about worth, about silence, about reclaiming a voice that was never allowed to rise above a whisper. I had never wanted attention for the sake of it. I had only wanted truth, and now that it had found me, I had no desire to dress it up in apology. The launch of the mentorship program had gone better than I could have imagined. The media outlets focused on the story of a teacher who had seen potential in a student others had overlooked, and the beauty of it was that every headline omitted the one detail my family had always clung to like armor: our last name. It was not a more success story. It was mine. Quiet, deliberate, and irrevocably mine. I poured myself a glass of water, no toast, no celebration, just the small act of hydrating a body that had carried too many years of tension, and as I sipped, I stared again at the final message, time-stamped just after midnight: "Call me. Please." But I didn't. I wouldn't. Because after everything, after the speech, the dinner, the envelope, the 17 messages, the truth was brutally simple. I had nothing left to say that they were ready to hear. And then, just as I placed the phone down and leaned back into the couch, eyes half closed and mind finally unclenching, it buzzed once more. Not a message this time, but a voicemail alert. A single new voicemail. From a number I didn't recognize at first. The area code hit me in the gut before the name even registered. I knew it before I played it. My father. The man who had walked out of our lives when I was 10 and who had been erased from family conversations with surgical precision, as if pretending he never existed could make the absence less noticeable. I hadn't heard from him in over 2 decades. Not a call, not a letter, not a photograph. His name had become a blank page, one I had long ago stopped trying to fill in. And now, of all nights, he had left a message. I pressed play. His voice was older, raspier, more measured than I remembered, but the rhythm was unmistakable. Rachel, he began, pausing as if unsure whether to continue. I saw your speech. I didn't know what to say for a long time. Maybe that was my problem. But I saw you. I heard you. And I think it's time we talked. That was all. No apology. No excuses. Just a sentence that lingered like smoke in a sealed room. I didn't replay it. I didn't delete it. I just sat there, staring into the kind of darkness that no longer frightened me, and let the weight of it settle across my chest because I wasn't sure what came next. I didn't know if I would call him back. I didn't know if the story had another chapter, or if this was the ending I had always needed but never allowed myself to write. All I knew was that, for the first time in my life, I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I had chosen myself.